Good afternoon and welcome to this amazing panel presentation on this anniversary of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima. On August 6th, 1945, Father Pedro Rupe, the future Superior General of the Society of Jesus, was at the Jesuit novitiate in Hiroshima. And then in what he described was something like a flash of magnesium, the atomic bomb, of course, exploded and knocking him and his companions to the ground. And he wrote in his diary, "I shall never forget my first sight of what was the result of the atomic bomb, a group of young women, 18 or 20 years old, clinging to one another as they dragged themselves out along the road. We did the only thing that could be done in the presence of such slaughter. We fell to our knees and prayed for guidance, destitute for all human help." Father Rupe survived that first atomic bomb, as you know, and with other Jesuits set up a makeshift hospital at the novitiate, attempting to save as many lives as possible. It's an event, of course, that haunted him and everyone who lived through it and survived it. And it's a topic he returned to time and again throughout his life. And 75 years later, we continue to grapple with the devastation and the ensuing nuclear proliferation that followed, that was spawned on that day. When the bomb doors of that B-25 Enola Gay opened on this anniversary, killing 70,000 people in an instant, there was a new age born that was rife with fears of bombing and nuclear winters shaping our thoughts in the remaining half of the 20th century. The church has grappled with this reality, as you know, the reality of possible imminent destruction at the hands of nuclear weapons over the last 8 decades as well, calling for peace, demanding new ethical frameworks for just war and sustainable peace in the atomic age, and working for nuclear non-proliferation. For Jesus Christ, the source and the summit of our salvation, the King of Peace, obviously demands nothing less from us than to work to those ends. America Magazine also has had a long history of commentary on the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course, all that followed. You can find those links at americamagazine.org. And we are very proud at America to be able to co-sponsor this discussion today with the Lumen Christi Institute, the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown. And I'm particularly grateful to our speakers, Dr. Andrew Bacevich, president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, who is a phenomenal thinker and writer on these topics, His Excellency Archbishop Timothy Broglio of the Archdiocese of Military Services for the United States, and finally, my predecessor here at America, Father Drew Christiansen, Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Human Development in Georgetown School of Foreign Service and a Senior Fellow at the Berkeley Center. I'm also grateful to Dr. Joseph Capizzi, Ordinary Professor of Moral Theology at CUA, to whom I now turn over today's discussion as I invite the speakers to unmute themselves and to join the conversation.
Thank you very much, Father Matt. On behalf of everybody over here at Catholic University and the Institute for Human Ecology, it's my pleasure to be able to be part of this conversation. It's also our pleasure to be working with you guys at America Media and the people at Lumen Christi and the Berkeley Center. I think this is an important event, and the importance of the event is no doubt testified to by the prominence of the speakers we were able to gather today to think through some of these questions before we have a conversation with the audience as well. So let's just start at the beginning. Today is the 75th anniversary of the first bombing, the bombing of Hiroshima. Father Drew, perhaps you could just begin our conversation by giving us a sense of what is the first thing that we should really be bringing to mind today, and also on the 9th when we think about these events. And then once you answer, perhaps our other panelists can weigh in as well.
Well, I think the first thing is, as the dedicatory slides at the beginning, which were those killed by the horrors of bombing in warfare in World War II. And since then, I just completed Eric Larson's book, The Splendid and the Vile, about the first year of the war and around Churchill's immediate circle at that time. And I'd read and seen pictures of the Battle of Britain, but I never realized how extensive that battle was, how many cities were bombed in Britain, and how that the fire bombings, if they were incendiary bombings, but to light the path for the bombers, preceded the actual bombing. And so there was multiple kinds of killings that went on week after week after week in Britain. So that the war was a horrid thing everywhere, but especially at the places we commemorate this week, because in an instant, whole cities were blown away, and the effects lingered with the survivors for years after. And so I think today we need to do two things. One is to mourn the dead. The two is to contemplate the horror of warfare, particularly of nuclear warfare, and ask ourselves, what is it we can do to bring about a lasting peace and eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth?
Thank you. Archbishop, do you want to add anything to that? Like what is sort of the first thing or the thing that you think we're really commemorating on a day like today?
Well, certainly I would join Father Christiansen in mourning all of those who died, and also lamenting that this war even took place. I also have a personal reflection in the sense that probably had Japan not surrendered when it did, I might not have existed, because my father probably would have been mobilized from Great Britain to fight on the Pacific front. So that's also a sobering thought.
Yeah, great, thank you. So one thing that Father Drew, you got to, and maybe Andy, you can begin to help us think through this, is that on the one hand, by this point in the war, by 1944, the bombing of civilians was routine. The slide that we just, we led off with named cities that were just among the cities where either the Allies or the Axis powers were directly targeting civilian populations. But we remember these days in particular. We don't typically commemorate the bombings of Dresden or London, among other cities. What is it about atomic or nuclear weapons that's different? Andy, maybe you could begin to help us think through this. Why do we remember these days differently than we do other bombings that were, like I said, routine by that part of the war?
Well, I think it is possible when we're dealing with aerial bombardment relying on conventional munitions. It's possible to create an argument that they are legitimate weapons of war. Now, when you get to Dresden, you get to Hamburg, you get to fire bombings of Tokyo, it's a bit of a stretch. But as instruments of conventional war, I think it is still possible to make an argument that there can be a moral justification. But I think with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it becomes impossible to do that. That there is something about the nature of these weapons that puts them in a different category. And also, I would add that their existence, their use on at least two occasions, invites a different perspective on the bombing that use conventional weapons. Invites a different perspective on Hamburg and Dresden and the fire bombings of of Tokyo. I would not have said this as a young man, but it does seem to me that this anniversary that we are commemorating really does pose radical new questions with regard to the morality of warfare and the circumstances in which waging war can be seen as politically acceptable, rational, instrumental.
Yeah, yeah. Could we stay here for just a little bit and maybe invite the other panelists in? Because it seems very important to me to think about these categories of legitimate and illegitimate weapons of war, right? On the one hand, those are old ideas, that there are some weapons that are illegitimate and some weapons that are legitimate to the practice of war, right? We know that for almost as long as you can look back to histories of war, you'll see some recollection that certain ways of fighting are illegitimate and certain are not. So I guess the question would be, what is it about these weapons that moves them into the category of illegitimate weapons, right? So we've spoken that way about poison gases, right? We speak that way about chemical weapons and so on, biological weapons now. What is it about nuclear weapons that provokes our imagination in a way that we want to say those seem illegitimate? Is it some combination of like after effects, the radioactive power that's left behind? Is it the instantaneous quality of it, or so on? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or Andy, maybe you can keep going.
Well, I mean,
giving this some thought.
I think it is not until your question.
Yeah.
It becomes exceedingly hard with nuclear weapons, becomes exceedingly hard to conjure up a scenario in which their use can be militarily purposeful and also at least make it possible to go through the motions of respecting the principle of non-combatant immunity.
Yeah.
I'm not a particular student of the Anglo-American combined bomber offensive in World War II in Europe, but certainly the Americans in particular, less so I think the RAF, but the Americans persuaded themselves that they were engaged in something that they called precision bombing. To a considerable extent, this was a lie, a convenient lie they told themselves. But nonetheless, they persuaded themselves that they were targeting military targets. Nobody was kidding themselves that there were not non-combatants also being killed, injured, and dehoused. But they persuaded themselves that they were at least making an honest effort to have the weapon of conventional strategic bombing conform to the basic principle of honoring non-combatant immunity. And I think that when you get to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even the pretense becomes obviously unpersuasive. And so we find ourselves in entirely new moral terrain.
Thank you. Father Drew, do you have any thoughts on that? Like why we regard these as illegitimate weapons, or why they're often thought of that way?
Well, there were those in the military at the time of the development and the first use of the weapons who argued against their use on grounds of discrimination. General Eisenhower for one, General Marshall for another, Admiral Leahy, I believe. They were all opposed to the use of the weapon and on grounds of discrimination. And so those principles were strong within the military. In fact, the US was reluctant to get involved in the air war in Germany for some time because it held to the principles of discrimination. Only over time did Churchill and the RAF persuade them. And I think the reasons that there is shame, if you will, to some extent expressed in the fact that Obama Harris, the head of the RAF command, was never honored with a knighthood, or that, as a matter of fact, the military hid the consequences of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki until John Hershey's novel was released in the New Yorker, Hiroshima, showing that they understood the consequences, that the public would understand that a great taboo had been violated here in an egregious way. With respect to your general question, it seems to me that a physicist would tell you, well, clearly there is a difference between a nuclear reaction and an ordinary physical reaction. And a nuclear reaction can create untold harm. I think in terms of its use in warfare, the question is, can it be used anywhere without involving wide-scale damage? The international lawyers at the time that the recent ban treaty was being debated at the UN were arguing for it on the grounds that there was a legal gap, if you will, in international law, because biological weapons and chemical weapons had both been forbidden as weapons of mass destruction. Everyone recognized the chief weapon of mass destruction remaining was nuclear weapons, and it hadn't been banned. And I think as time has gone on, we've understood more and more the consequences of nuclear weapons. It was the humanitarian consequences movement that led to the ban treaty from 2013 on to 2017. There we became conscious too of the ecological impact and the generational impact of the bombs, which put them in a wholly different class on other weapons. There's no usable nuclear weapon. I mean, the smaller they get, there's no way to distinguish them then from conventional weapons. So the ones that we call small are 15 times the size of the ones that were used at Hiroshima. So it seems to me that there are lots of reasons to see them as a different kind of weapon that needs real stringent response.
One of the, we've used the language of discrimination or distinction with regard to non-combatant immunity and so on. Maybe, Father Drew, you could just spend a minute spelling that out, but what that means for our listeners, in part, or attentive to an argument that we know existed at the time, right? One of the arguments at the time that was used to justify their use was that the Japanese population was militarized, right? That it was ready to fight every last man, woman, and child, right? To defend itself against Allied invasion. So doesn't that mean then, or wouldn't that follow then, that discrimination or distinction is irrelevant in their case?
No, it's not. I mean, I don't think that, I mean, if when the Nazis would execute civilians after one of their people had been killed by a resistance fighter, so they'd line up 10 at Lidice, right, at one of the other towns where this kind of execution was taking place, we regard that as unjust. Yeah, you might be able to if you could find the resistance killer, it might be just to kill the particular, but you can't kill innocent people for what warriors are taking up. The notion of war is that soldiers are permitted to carry arms and to kill because they're doing it in the defense of others. Therefore, they're only allowed to use the weapons against other military personnel. So the distinction is a classic one between warriors and the non-combatants. And non-combatants are civilians generally, but they fit into lots of other categories, including prisoners and the hospitalized and so on. We get into lots of casuistry about what about the margins, but the basic distinction is essential to warfare as a morally governed activity. The problem with nuclear weapons is they break all those categories. I mean, there's no way you can sustain them. And therefore, either at a point in time or across time. I mean, both they're violating the notion of discrimination. So it seems to me that nuclear weapons are just, almost ineradicably indiscriminate when it comes to their use in battle.
So Andy began by pointing out, as a young man, how he would have thought differently than he does now about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Archbishop Broglio, you mentioned how you might not even be here had the war not ended shortly after those bombings. I also grew up, a young person thinking uncritically that, of course, their use was appropriate and so on. A lot of Americans and a lot of Catholic Americans are going to think and do think that it's a minority view to hold as strictly as we seem to be in this conversation to this principle of discrimination that would judge this use as immoral. And yet, as I think I recall correctly, every bishop has condemned every pope has condemned their use since their use then. Is this standard Catholic teaching, Archbishop Broglio, on this issue that, at least morally, that it's wrong to intend the killing of innocent people, even for such great a good as perhaps the shortening of war?
Well, I think you have to make a number of distinctions here, which are not being made. For one thing, we're not called here to make a judgment on the use of nuclear arms in 1945. That's been done. And, you can argue the figures all you want, the 784,000 Japanese troops that were amassed at the point of entry in Japan, the 575,000 home defense forces. We've already surpassed the number of people who died either at Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
Right.
Those are all, from my point of view, they're all interesting questions. I think a more important question is working to make sure that this event, if you want to call it that, that this use of nuclear arms never happens again. And I think that's what certainly what the Holy Fathers have advocated, from Pius XII onward, and that's perhaps a more fruitful type of discussion to have, because we can't change what happened in 1945.
And what is the current state of Catholic teaching on nuclear weapons, Archbishop?
The current state?
Yeah.
Well, I think we have all kinds of invitations that they not be used. Even if we go back to St. John Paul II in 1982, urging that that accepting that they exist for deterrence, but urging that they not be used, up until Pope Francis saying in Japan that we shouldn't even possess them. I mean, I think you have the full gamut there, from deterrence to not having them at all.
Anybody else want to add anything to that? Thank you, Archbishop.
Well, I think it's
on the current state of things.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that Pope Francis talks of us as a teaching, learning church, and he puts emphasis on people learning. And I think what he's inviting people to do is to ponder these issues and to see what they can do to see that it's ended. The Holy See, in signing and then ratifying the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, has indicated it's cast its lot with people who think that nuclear weapons ought to be banned. And Francis has condemned them in his own remarks. But the question is, what will we do about it? Working for abolition is important. I think language on abolition can be seen as far back as Pope John XXIII. Pope John Paul II, a year before he made his UN speech accepting the use of nuclear weapons for deterrence solely, indicated that he wanted people to work for disarmament and that the goal had to be elimination of nuclear weapons. Pope Benedict did the same at the end of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in 2010. He spoke about the need to lean into the question of proliferation, preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and work for their elimination. Pope Francis, now in condemning the use of nuclear weapons in their possession, effectively rules out even deterrence. And the task now is to fulfill the whole question of elimination. How do we move ahead where we stand, whatever community we're in? What are our responsibilities, or what actions do we take to help advance that process, the elimination of nuclear weapons?
Well, if that's the
Yeah,
task,
please.
then it seems to me that we can't simply put the events of 1945 behind us and say, well, that was then. We're in a different time now. I mean, I believe I am correct in saying that US military intelligence in the summer of 1945 knew that the Japanese government was looking for a way to end the war. I may be misremembering, but I believe it was a Japanese approach to the Soviet government. I can see the Archbishop wagging his head, but I think I'm correct. We can't know where that would have led, but it is not correct. It's not historically correct to say that there was no alternative to dropping the bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945. Joseph, you a few minutes ago said asked whether or not the critical view of Hiroshima, in terms of American public opinion, might be a minority view.
Right.
I haven't seen sort of polls, but I would bet my paycheck that of course it's a minority view.
Right. Right.
Why is that? Well, that's because of the preference that we have for taking a morally sanitized view of this worst war in all of history. And I made the allusion to what I would have thought as a boy. When I was a boy, I certainly viewed World War II as unambiguously a war of good against evil. And I have to say that at my now advanced age, I think that is an oversimplification that we should do well to challenge, as long as World War II is held up as this unique moment in history that pitted good against evil, that it makes it that much more difficult for us as Americans to come to terms with our role in the world subsequent to World War II, because the moral overhang of World War II, which continues down to the present moment, I think obstructs serious self-understanding. Again, not an understanding specifically related to Hiroshima, but a serious understanding of why we have done what we have done in the world, and whether or not what we have done contributes to peace, contributes to a world in which war is banished. And I must say that from my point of view, the answer to that question is we've done a heck of a lot that since 1945 that has done anything but contribute to a world that is more peaceful. We've made lots of tragic mistakes. And I think the unwillingness to confront the moral complexity of World War II creates barriers to understanding the moral complexity of our history from 1945 down to the present moment.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond to that, Archbishop, maybe, or Father Drew?
Archbishop?
Well, go ahead, Father.
Well, I sympathize with Andrew's point about World War II. It is morally complex in many ways, but I think we are in an especially acute moment in the history of geopolitics and military affairs, in what the authors of the Daedalus issue in the spring called the new nuclear era, the nuclear era of modernization, autonomous weapons, and artificial intelligence. And the new world in which there's not 2 nuclear powers, but 9 nuclear powers, and 4 of them outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So getting things under control is far more difficult now, both for geopolitical reasons and for technological reasons, than it was in the 1960s or the 1980s. And so this moment is peculiarly dangerous. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has illustrated that by moving the clock, the doomsday clock, to 100 seconds before midnight to illustrate how dangerous it is. It's as dangerous as it's been since 1953, when the Russians dropped their first hydrogen weapon. And at the same time, we have the US and the Russians doing away with the architecture of arms control and disarmament. So it seems to me this is a very, very perilous time, and one in which we have to take very serious stock of ourselves and our leaders and our military policy for that reason.
Archbishop, anything?
The only thing I would add was I would certainly agree that World War II is a morally complex issue, and certainly it was the ultimate solution of the Depression for the United States at that time. Not that they entered the war because of that reason, but I mean that's certainly a contributing factor. So I mean I don't think anything is black and white here, and of course war is always an evil. It's always a failure. I spent 25 years of my life as a diplomat trying to avoid that failure by having dialogue and encouraging conversation. So I think the point there is very well taken.
Let me move on in a manner suggested perhaps by Archbishop, but also by Father Drew, to sort of where we are right now, and moving forward. An argument that we're all aware of for the status quo, a status quo of nuclear deterrence, even with 9 or more states possessing nuclear weapons, is, as you all know, that while we've avoided some major conflicts, it seems like, as a consequence of some states' possession of nuclear weapons, right? So India and Pakistan, Israel and enemies, obviously, during the Cold War. Is there something to tell our listeners about that? Is that argument simply bunk in your eyes, or is there something to that makes perilous even a kind of moral requirement of drawing back from nuclear weapons? Maybe Drew, you can take the first swipe at that, if that question makes sense.
Well, your colleague at Catholic University of America, Marian Cusimano Love, reminds us that trying to trying to police the world to keep it free from nuclear weapons has created as many problems as not. I mean, the efforts, so the bombing in Syria, the bombings in Iraq, the rewarding of malefactors. I mean, India was given civilian nuclear aid after it had developed its weapons outside the NPT. We turn our eyes at Israel's development of the bomb. We even go so far in 2015 as to prevent the conclusion of the NPT review conference because Israel doesn't want there to be even the beginning of a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. And it was only 3 countries that stopped that consensus: the US, Canada, and Great Britain. I put it this way: I don't think the nuclear powers and the Non-Proliferation Treaty have any moral right, certainly, and probably no legal right that's a legacy right to nuclear weapons. The NPT has been used again and again as a cudgel to work against non-nuclear states and not to hold the nuclear states responsible. And I think if the NPT review conference delayed now until January, which is a terrible time for the US to have it delayed with the shift of governments, but I think that there needs to be real attention to the disarmament by all the nuclear powers at this particular junction, but beginning with the 2 old superpowers, Russia and the US. And China may come in once they demonstrate that they're really sincere about resuming those discussions. So I think that that the Article 6 of the NPT really needs to be held up as a principle that is requirement to disarm effectively and with expeditiously of nuclear weapons is essential to the preservation of the NPT. If the nuclear states don't show their good faith in that, the NPT will fall apart. The ban treaty itself, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, exemplifies that. 122 states voted for it. Now, some 30 or 40 now have signed it. I'm sorry, 30 or 40 have ratified it. More, I think about 80 something have signed it. But it represented a consensus of the non-nuclear states that something had to be done besides the NPT to stop the expansion of nuclear weapons.
But Andy, shouldn't we worry that will lead to conflicts where there have not been conflicts, like between major blown out conflicts between Pakistan and India or other states that the argument goes seem to be prevented by one or both parties' possession of nuclear weapons? But differently, isn't this conducing to a kind of peace, a kind of warlessness, where there might otherwise be war?
I don't think I'd sign up to the term warlessness.
Yeah, sorry, maybe a little strong.
I think it's more war, but not nuclear war, conflict, but not nuclear conflict. And yeah, we could, given that nuclear conflict between opposing sides with nuclear weapons really would seem to be the ultimate catastrophe. I mean, putting humankind as a whole in jeopardy. We want to prevent that. But, and I'm not one of these theologians of nuclear strategy, but it does seem to me that the logic of deterrence and assumptions about the prerequisites of deterrence should be subject to reexamination. I mean, from my point of view, an example of this is the question of no first use. Yeah, I think I'm correct in saying that successive American administrations, the issue of no first use comes up from time to time, and has been soundly rejected by American policymakers who insist that for the United States to embrace no first use would then, put us on a slippery slope to where deterrence would no longer be effective. I think that should be questioned. I think there's a counter argument, and the counter argument is if we can move to a regime in which all nuclear powers commit to a posture of no first use, that arguably that would be a significant step toward creating conditions where real disarmament could in fact be pursued. And there, I think the United States, if the United States doesn't take a leadership position on that issue, then nothing happens. And we end up where we are right now, where our nation has embarked upon a massively expensive program of nuclear modernization, where over the next, I think, 20 years or so, I think this program is supposed to continue until something like 2035. We're building new missile launching submarines. We're building a new strategic bomber. We're building new land-based ICBMs, and we're building new warheads, which this is alluding to something somebody said a few minutes ago, are quote unquote smaller and therefore said to be more usable. Given our circumstances as a nation and the multiple crises that we're facing right now, and given larger security concerns, such as climate change, such as the increasingly difficult competition between ourselves and China, I am hard pressed to understand why spending $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion modernizing our nuclear arsenal is a good idea. I think it is a waste of money. And also the fact that modernization program has gotten virtually no serious public attention. It's not being discussed as part of our presidential election. I think that also signifies the extent to which in the political arena, the nuclear question in our country has been simply shrugged off, and that's bad.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that people in the generations below mine simply almost take it as a kind of fact of life and don't question it at all. But maybe now we should turn to the questions from our audience members. So if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to type it into the Q&A box. There's a bunch there right away. And what I'll do is I'll just read them and I'll try to direct them to the panelists who it seems most appropriate to, but I also invite my other panelists to weigh in. The first of these, Archbishop, seems pretty clearly directed to you. Why can't or why don't the US bishops link halting the nuclear atomic bomb production and possession to a major preeminent pro-life issue such as abortion? Pope Francis is very clear on this. Why are bishops hesitant to do this, Archbishop? Why won't they link this issue of nuclear atomic weapons and their production and so on to the issue of pro-life in general? Any insight into that?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is, well, I don't speak for the U.S. bishops. I
know.
The Archbishop for the Military Services. But I think the first issue there is that when we talk about the right to life and in the abortion question, it is preeminent. And I think you're talking about two different things here. Now, I would certainly favor using the money that we might spend on modernizing nuclear weapons to spend them on on social issues. I would certainly be in favor of that. But I don't think that that we can put the two things on the same page.
Okay, thank you. And again, like I said, if anybody wants to weigh in, don't hesitate, Drew or Andy. Okay, here's a question similar to the one that we've asked before. We don't discuss alternatives. Japanese civilians were staring at an increasing number. I think, Archbishop, actually, you were quite sensitive to this. The deaths of Japanese, if we had invaded, would have greatly exceeded those lost to the bombs, et cetera. And the questioner, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, notes that we seem to have had an unprecedented 75 years without any large-scale wars. Again, this is a kind of argument that, however horrific Hiroshima and Nagasaki might have been, that, you know, a kind of a fair calculus at the moment, and a lot of other historical factors we're all aware of really seem to urge that we use these weapons, and that in fact they produced a kind of peace.
Could I handle that one?
I think, yeah, please, Andy.
I'll answer it in 4 words, if I could. Korea, Vietnam, and Persian Gulf. I mean, the notion that somehow since 1945 we have enjoyed this era of non-war is simply doesn't stand up to even the slightest examination. The American strategic bombing campaign in the Korean War is like one of the great secrets of US military history hidden in plain sight. As soon as the North invaded the South, we embarked upon an effort to destroy every major North Korean city. And indeed, we achieved great success in doing that. I don't think there are anything like accurate figures about the number of North Koreans that were killed. And again, we're talking about North Korean civilians for the most part. But I believe a rough estimate is something on the order of 1 million or so. Similarly, the bombing of North Vietnam, of Laos, of Cambodia during the Vietnam War, horrific casualties pursuant to our effort to try to maintain the existence of the Republic of Vietnam. So this notion that Hiroshima has bought us peace, maybe it persuades others, but it doesn't persuade me.
Yeah, I would add to that the notion that we escaped nuclear stealth, I think is mistaken, that we came very close any number of times. There are 2 celebrated instances of Russians. One is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there was a Russian sub that was being depth charged by the U.S. Navy, and the launch of a nuclear torpedo was something that the captain wanted to do to save the ship, but his flotilla commander, who was the 3rd key, refused to do that. If he hadn't done that, there would have been a nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia, and east coast of the U.S. would have been destroyed. In another instance that well documented in a celebrated movie, The Man Who Saved the World, Colonel Petrov, who was a missile commander, 6 times refused launch orders from the computerized systems because he mistrusted them. And again, saved us from nuclear war. Last night I heard Bill Perry, the former defense secretary, said he knows of at least 3 times when there was a close call on being, because of hair trigger kinds of responses, that we would have been launched into war, nuclear war. And there's numerous very detailed histories of various accidents that have taken place that could have been catastrophic. So it seems to me that nuclear war has been getting, nuclear weapons have gotten a false reputation for saving peace when they've really endangered the peace and much more than we understand.
I suspect some of this goes to your earlier point, Andy, about how we understand the Second World War, right? And the presence or absence of moral ambiguity with regard to it, and how we understand subsequent conflicts, and having been saved from from war, and some kind of peace existing. That strikes me as something worth a lot of reflection itself. But we do have a question that relates to this, and one of our audience members wants maybe you, Andy, to fill out this just a little bit more if you can. What is what is this, like, the specifics of the case for moral ambiguity in the Second World War? Because most of us, right, think of it as that's a pretty black and white situation. Germany, aggressive invading power, Japan, aggressive imperial power. And we, like other countries, were basically backed into having to defend ourselves. Now, I mean, you don't have to fill this out fully, but just give the audience a couple of points maybe that might help them.
So let me try not to be misunderstood. No doubt in my mind that World War II was a just war. No doubt in my mind that the Nazi regime was pure, unadulterated evil and needed to be destroyed. Frankly, I think that the issue of the Pacific War is considerably more complicated. So let me focus on that just for a minute.
Sure.
And I don't want to suggest that Japan was not the aggressor in December of 1941, not simply attacking the United States, but launching an offensive throughout Southeast Asia.
Right.
But there is a context that needs to be understood. And the context really goes back to 1898, when the United States created a maritime empire in the Western Pacific as a consequence of the Spanish-American War, and put an imperial United States on a collision course with an imperial Japan that was intent on becoming a great power. I won't rehearse everything that happened between 1898 and 1941, but I would say this, tactically, the attack on Pearl Harbor came out of the blue, but from a strategic point of view, it was a long time coming. And was a consequence of a competition between the United States and Japan for who was going to be the dominant power in the Western Pacific. They attacked Pearl Harbor out of desperation because of the pressure that we were exerting that faced them with the choice that they believed either they were going to forfeit their empire or they were going to have to embark upon this incredibly reckless war against the United States. They sure made the wrong choice. But I think it is necessary to acknowledge the context in which that came about. And it wasn't a context in which everything did was bad and everything that we did was good, because we were, in fact, an imperial power with imperial ambitions in the Pacific.
Thank you. Here's a question that shifts gears a little bit back towards perhaps Archbishop and Father Drew. From a friend of mine. What does the church say to members of the US military when they ask about the use of nuclear weapons? How can they fulfill their obligation to follow valid orders from their commanders? So, for instance, he continues, let's assume the US satisfied the ad bellum criteria of the just war theory and the Japanese population was not militarized. Would the panelists have counseled a non-nuclear option in which the foreseen collateral damage was proportionate, but nevertheless would have resulted in more Japanese civilian deaths than the two atomic bombs? It's a tough one. Let's just start with the first part of that then, perhaps Archbishop and Father Drew. What do you say to US military members about, what if anything, about nuclear weapons?
Generally, I mean, in my conversations, and I've certainly visited installations that have nuclear weapons, but my understanding would be obviously to use to apply the just war theory if there were. I mean, I think all of us live in the hopes that that order never comes. I'm at this point in time, I think it would be hard to justify that there would be a just use of nuclear arms. I suppose I'd have to see the concrete situation that presents itself.
I'd first suggest that the concerned military personnel and officers go back and look at the recommendations for people holding specific positions in the Bishop's Pastoral of 1983. It seems to me that that's a good place to begin to see where their responsibilities are. I think that the second is to understand that both church teaching, and this includes Vatican II, maybe especially Vatican II, and military law requires that people not carry out illegal orders. And illegal, in this case, is immoral orders. I mean, I think both the present and the previous SAC commanders have testified in hearings before Congress that was presented with an illegal order, they would go back and say, no, that's an illegal order. I can't perform it. Here are the alternative suggestions for use of force. I think that's an important place to begin. The second place to begin is that they really need to know how to assess what a legal and illegal order is. They should seek counsel from their JAG officers. We may have gone to excess bringing JAG officers into targeting decisions in the Obama administration, but nonetheless, I think they can offer advice here. And lastly, I think they have to look at the complexities of the present situation and say, given the Pope's teaching condemning the use of nuclear weapons and their possession, what does that say to me in conscience? Where is the Spirit moving me to take action? And how might I, with other people, other Christians who are conscientious and other people of goodwill in the military, how should we take responsibility at this moment? That's where it started me.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question, a different one, but related to some of our prior conversation. One of our audience members writes, in the last few days, he has come across reports by people familiar with the brutality of the Japanese military against people and women in particular in China, Malaysia, and other Asian nations who are thankful for the atomic weapons that ended the war and Japanese brutality in their countries. Does that affect our thinking about these weapons? The audience member asks, and the argument's, quite straightforward, right? Does the fact that these may have accelerated the end of the war and ended Japanese imperial brutality in Asia cause you guys to reconsider, their use?
Not at all, not at all. I deny the supposition that there were no alternatives. If Marshall and Eisenhower and Leahy all advised against it, and Eisenhower told us after the war we need to be aware of the military-industrial complex because of this issue, and Vatican II has told us that we need to that it's a crime against God and humanity to aim at the devastation of wide areas and their populations. It seems to me we need to say it was not a suitable means at that time. There are lots of people, not only in intelligence, but historians now. I've seen several during the last couple of weeks, several symposia of historians saying, look, we now know that it was the possible Russian invasion of the islands and the fear of losing the northern islands that turned the Japanese policy around, not the bombings. So it seems to me that we need to take the air out of that supposition that there were no alternatives. people in authority knew there were alternatives at that time, and they didn't choose to act on them, and they chose to cover them up for a couple of years at least.
Anybody else on that one? Okay, here's another one. How does the fact that non-state organizations are seeking access to nuclear weapons affect states' thinking about nuclear disarmament? So the rise of non-state entities that might be on the market for nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, does that actually affect the way states think about these issues? Maybe Father Drew, maybe you know a little bit about this. It
does affect the way states think about it, not for the better, because it's one of the places where the U.S. at different points in the nuclear posture reviews have, has said that the U.S. might use nuclear weapons if they felt that a terrorist was close to using one. But I think the better lead is from George Shultz, former Secretary of State, Bill Perry, this former Secretary of Defense, former Senator Nunn, former Secretary of State Kissinger, said in light of 9/11, they changed their minds, and for 15 years now have been advocating for abolition, because they said, as Kissinger said, the U.S. can't go on saying we're the only ones, or only ourselves and our trusted friends can have the weapons and no one else can. You can't go on in the kind of world we have. And so what we have to do is to move on path towards abolition. And so Schultz and his colleagues have been working on that now for 15 years. I think that's the proper conclusion to draw from the threat of non-state actors getting a hold of the weapons.
Let me ask you a question. Once the genie's out of the bag, is there some effective way to make sure that non-state actors do not obtain nuclear weapons, or do not develop nuclear weapons?
I don't think there's any foolproof way. I think, as Pope John said, at a certain point you have to learn to trust in a situation. But I think that you can go far. I think the non-Lugar legislation did a lot to secure the materiel that terrorists might have utilized, and I think the last few years that's gone by the wayside. But I think to renew and strengthen that kind of activity of the non-Lugar legislation would be very important, where we secure with the Russians and with the help of other people various supplies of enriched uranium that could be used in building a bomb.
Another question relates to perhaps the genie in the bottle, and that says, can the use of nuclear weapons be unlinked from the use of nuclear power? Are you aware of whether, in other words, it seems to be sort of suggesting, do we have to just sort of try to stuff that genie back in the bottle across the board, or because these things are just too linked? Any thoughts on that, anybody?
Well, I'm not a nuclear engineer, but I believe that nuclear power plants, that is to say power plants that exist to produce electrical energy, can be designed so that the nuclear materials that they use, and I think reproduce, can be below the grade that is useful for nuclear weapons. It's also true, you can design a nuclear power plant that will produce materials that can be used for nuclear weapons. So it's an engineering issue, and then it's also an issue of international openness with regard to what kind of nuclear facilities exist and whether or not those nuclear facilities are open for inspection. So it is possible, I think, as Father Christiansen said here, there's no guarantees, But I think
Right.
it's possible to design a system in which nuclear power can be available as a source of energy with minimal expectations that there'll be a source of weaponry.
The late John Steinbrenner from the University of Maryland headed a committee for the National Academy of Science that, in terms of looking at a kind of carbon-free future, argued that you could have a series of small contained reactors that wouldn't, and produce your energy not in large plants, but in these smaller units in such a way that they couldn't be tampered with, and they couldn't, they wouldn't have the residues that would permit the use of the material for bomb making. But I've asked engineers and physicists about that, and I said, well, if that could happen, we're still a while from that happening. It's not a present engineering reality.
Great. Okay, final question. We've been talking a long time, and I think it's been really informative. One of our audience members asks whether there's a racial component to the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. In other words, is it not merely coincidental or a consequence of timing that we were prepared to use the weapons in Japan? Is there any evidence with regard to this as opposed to in Europe? Anybody aware?
Well, the war ended in Europe. The war ended in Europe before
Right.
the bomb was available. I think it is a historical fact that the initial motivation for the Manhattan Project was stemmed from the conviction that Nazi Germany had a nuclear weapons program, and the fear that it was going to be successful. I think we know in retrospect that technologically they were lagging behind the United States, but the initial impetus of the Manhattan Project was to develop a weapon that would be directed against Germany.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Unless you gentlemen, have any final thoughts, and I welcome you if you do. I think we'll call this to conclusion. Like I said, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm deeply grateful to all of our panelists for being a part of this, and of course to the audience members for listening. I think it's been again informative and a difficult conversation at times to have. So on behalf of the Berkeley Center for Religion and Peace and World Affairs, on behalf of Lumen Christi, the Institute for Human Ecology, of which I am a part, and America Media, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time this afternoon, for joining us, and wish you well for the rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.